Okay, students, can you hear me? Can one of you please reply on chat if you can hear me? Okay, fine. So we will start at 11:03 sharp. I am sharing the screen. Can you see the screen? Okay, fine, very good. Okay, so today we will study another interesting paper. The paper itself in its name has the word media bias, and we will see how the authors constructed something called a media bias monitor. So this is work that has been jointly done by two groups, one from Germany and one from Brazil. And this work was accepted in ICWSM 2018. And the slides that I am presenting here has been generously made available by Abhijnan Chakraborty, who is a good friend of mine. So thanks to him. It's one of his works, which we are going to read out today. So thanks again, once again, for sharing your slides with us. Okay, so the news landscape is actually changing. So last day we have read a paper where we were looking into mostly the print media of news. The paper was from 1991. Now this is a relatively recent paper where we will see how media bias can be observed in the current landscape. So what is the current landscape? So the point is that if you look at the US population, 2/3 of the US adults actually have the habit of getting news from social media. So it's so this is an important change in the landscape, right? Because the power of traditional media and channels seem to be diminishing. So it's mostly through the social media that we are consuming news, and it's not only in the US. It's kind of seems like all pervasive, and the number is only increasing. Like in 2016 it was 62%, in 2017 it was 67%, and it seems like if you look at it now it will be much larger. And the Pew Research Center has actually made a nice bucketing of the users who actually often consume news from social media, or at least sometimes consume social news from social media, or hardly consumes news from social media. So overall, it seems like there is an increase, or there is a surge in use of the social media as a mode of consumption of news. The other, so the moment we open this floodgate, the immediate problems that one observes are as follows. So you see now, since news can be made available on the social media, anybody can, become a news producer. Okay. So it's like you really don't need absolutely any investment, but still you can become a news outlet. Okay, and anyone can promote news stories to other readers. So these are some challenging issues that are coming up, and one example that has been cited here is of breaking news. Look at the number of followers that this news agency actually has accumulated. So the number of tweets, the number of followers, it's like huge. So this is actually another problem that we will talk of in a while. So the question therefore is that, are there any biases in these outlets? So we have studied biases in traditional news outlets like the Prestige Press or the large daily circulation newspapers that we have seen last year. But these are a different story here. So it's like the social media has been opened up, and people can share any sorts or any form of news there, and they can become a news producer absolutely with no investment, without any authenticity check. So, and this evidently raises concern that whether there are biases in these outlets. So, and these biases can actually can actually be an important point to study, because as we have already talked earlier, so this might result into fake news, extreme opinions, conspiracy theories. So all these things could be resultant of this kind of biases. So, and we have already looked into some of them in some of our earlier classes. So as I was telling you, that in the traditional media, there has been some studies, and there has been media watchdogs actually who have been trying to understand and identify the biases or the inclination of different media houses. For instance, here you see a scale starting from blue to red, showing newspapers who are kind of more liberal to newspapers who are kind of more conservative. This is only showing the US statistics. So and in fact, well-informed consumers are very much aware of these publisher biases. So when they consume some news, they actually are pretty aware that whatever news they are consuming are kind of biased, because there are these traditional bias studies that have been already performed, and there are these watchdogs who have been actually portraying like the extent of bias for these well-known media houses. However, as I said, in social media, the challenge is different. Like, you can have anybody and everybody being a news producer, okay? And then identifying the bias toward any one of them is not so easy. So you cannot have, watchdogs for any and every one of them. So you need to have some alternative mechanisms to identify the bias that emerges in the social media news production. So that is what the authors try to do in the rest of the paper, and you'll see that they took a very interesting approach to achieve this. So as I said, the number of challenges when you try to identify bias in the social media news production context, so the challenges are actually manifold. So many of these social media news outlets do not have any offline presence. That is, they do not have a print media. Okay, so they are only present in the social media platforms. And the accounts of these news outlets are registered under different names. So they could be registered under the name of newspaper, media, news company, news and media website, magazine, media and broadcasting and media production company, publisher, etc. So hundreds of different of names that they can adopt. So you understand, like, so it's very difficult to actually, gather information about them. So if you use like any and every keyword associated to news and media, so then it becomes a very difficult task to actually gather information about them, leave alone their bias. So presently there is no system that exists to monitor the bias of the social media news outlets. And this is what the authors of this particular paper set out for. So they try to reframe this problem. Like the question that they pose is how to quantify biases of news outlets in social media at scale. So I remember I talked about this with you long back, like you can have small scale experiments with very few subjects, or you can, or very few data points, or you can try to, scale up your experiments so that, the evidences that you get are more strong. And we have seen like how people use active learning mechanisms to enhance the scale of their experiments. So let's see what the authors do here. So the prime point, the prime hypothesis of the authors is as follows. So they ask the simple question: can they utilize the intended audience of the news publishers to measure their bias? So basically, they want to see who or what set of people on social media are consuming the news produced by a certain agency, by a certain intended audience. Okay, so that is what they are trying to identify. And is there some story hidden out there? So can someone make some sense from this distribution of audience? Okay, if somehow we can gather this audience, the audience that actually goes and reads up news from certain news publishers, if we can gather that information, can that become an indicator of the level of bias that a particular news outlet has in the social media? So that is the question. So is this clear? Is this slide clear? If the hypothesis is not clear, then no point proceeding further. So can you please let me know through chat, like if this hypothesis that the authors are trying to place or posit is clear with all of you? Then I'll move. So basically, rather than trying to find the bias, of the newspaper itself, you try to find out the bias of the consumers of the newspaper. Okay. And can that be used as a proxy for the bias of the news outlet itself? Yes, Soham says that, so it is trying to quantify bias from the audience. That's exactly what they're trying to do. Okay, so they are trying to quantify the bias from the audience or the consumer of the news. Okay, so we proceed. So now, if you want to do this, you have two key challenges. First of all, find all news publishers on Facebook. This is not an easy task, as we will see. Okay, and then gathering the demographics of their audience. So there are two tasks that you have to solve if you want to actually operationalize the hypothesis that they have stated. So the first thing is you have to find all news publishers on Facebook somehow. And the second thing is you have to gather the demographics of their audience, of each of these news publishers. So let's see step by step how the authors try to achieve this. So there is no direct way to identify the Facebook pages of individual newspapers or news outlets. So what the authors do is the following. So they try to collect Facebook pages corresponding to every news domain that is included in Google News, 300 most popular news domains that is listed in Alexa, and a list of news outlets curated from different blogs. And this set of news outlets is listed in this website. If you go to this website, you'll get a list of these news outlets. So they take all these set of news domains, and then they try to find out the Facebook pages for each of these news domains. That again is not an easy thing. So in order to find out the Facebook pages, they take a three-pronged approach. And this is what the three-pronged approach looks like. So first of all, they search in the news media websites. So all the websites that they have collected in the previous step, from Google News, from Alexa, and from the self-curated blogs. So from all those news websites, they try to find out the all the references corresponding to Facebook pages. Now, if such a URL is present, they fetch the name of the URL and the URL itself, okay? And then they try to match this name and the URL with the name of the newspaper and the URL of the newspaper. For instance, I have given an example. So if the URL of the newspaper is www.nytimes.com, the Facebook page should typically look like www.facebook.com nytimes. Okay, so they are trying to make this kind of a mapping. So they look for all the occurrences of Facebook page references, names of those, and the URLs, and from that they try to match these names and the URLs with the names and the URLs of the media outlet, and they try to see if a mapping exists. Okay, if such a mapping exists, they record this mapping. So they now know that the Facebook page for the New York Times newspaper is www.facebook.com/New York Times. Okay, so if no such match is found in the first step, then they search for news domains like say nytimes.com, cnn.com, using the Facebook Graph API. So there is a Graph API, I guess you know the Facebook Graph search, it is very popular. So they use this graph search technique to find out the domain names. Now, if they find some Facebook pages, then they look at the name and the URL of these Facebook pages and compare it with the news media outlet name and URL. If this match, then again they instantiate a mapping. So the second part is same as the first part. Okay, it's only that here they search through the Facebook Graph API. And then even if in the second stage they are not able to establish a mapping, they go to the third stage where they use the name of the news outlet and they search the Facebook Graph API with this name. Okay, and if the name and if a similar name appears through the graph search, then they compare the URL of corresponding to that name with the URL of the media outlet, and if the two URLs match, then they consider it to be a instantiation of a mapping. So in this way they map each news domain to a Facebook page. Is this clear? Can one of you chat and tell me if the steps are clear to you? So this is how a mapping from a news domain URL to a Facebook page URL happens. Okay, fine. So Punaja says it's clear. So now each Facebook page has to be connected to something called an interest ID. We will soon see why this is important. This is important to collect the audience demographics. So what the authors do is they search for interests associated with a Facebook page, okay, by using the Facebook marketing API. So there is an API called the Facebook marketing API. I remember when I was teaching you the discrimination through optimization paper, I already talked about these APIs, but again, just to reiterate, so Facebook actually has this marketing API through which you can know the interests associated with a Facebook page. Okay, so the API call returns a list of interests associated with every page. Now, if the interest name is identical to the Facebook name, then the Facebook page name, then the Facebook page is linked to that corresponding interest ID. So the interest ID is the key to the rest of our analysis. So this allows us to collect the demographic information of all the audience interested in the corresponding Facebook page. For instance, if the interest ID of New York Times will allow us to gather the demographic information of the audience interested in the news outlet, the New York Times. Okay. So you see there is this two levels of mapping. One from the news domain to the Facebook page, and then from the Facebook page to the corresponding interest ID using the Facebook marketing API. Okay. So now, after this entire process, the authors landed up into 2466 Facebook page interest ID pairs. Okay. But then they question that can this number be scaled up? So 2466 was also, seems like the authors were not happy with this number. These also appeared to be small and not actually at scale. And therefore they sought additional methods as to how to increase this number. Okay. And let's see what they do. So here in this snapshot at the left hand side, I am showing you the marketing API. So this is how the API looks. So now you see there is this block called, there is a chat message. So there is a question from Shoham. So he's asking what is meant by identical to FB name. Does it mean interests have to be synonymous with the page name, news outlet name in FB? Okay, so every FB page can be related to multiple interests. Okay, now one of these interests is the page matches with the page name itself. We are interested in only that interest. Am I clear? So if every FB page, when you search for through the marketing API, you will see that a lot of interests come in. We are only interested in that interest ID which matches with the name of the page identically. Is that clear? Okay, fine. So I see an okay. So now the question is that how do you increase the number? So you see on the left hand side, there is a snapshot of the marketing API. And this interest that you see is actually asking you for the interest ID. And here in the interest ID, you feed, say, New York Times. Okay. Now, as soon as you feed New York Times, what happens is that this marketing API actually gives you a lot of recommendations, other recommendations. Okay. So when you feed New York Times into the marketing API, the recommendations that come up are Wall Street Journal, Vice, The Economist, Harvard Business Review, etc., etc. So the author did a nice trick here. So they used a simple BFS approach, starting from the 2466 interest IDs that they have gathered, and collected all the recommendations from each of these interest IDs. Am I clear? So it's like a crawler. So they're using a BFS crawler. So starting from all the 2466 interest IDs that they have collected in the first phase, they use them as seed and collect all the recommendations that they obtain, and then do a BFS, recursive. So this is a recursive approach, and crawl as many as suggestions as possible. So in total, they get 240,000 related pages. Okay, they kept only those that are categorized as newspaper, magazine, journalist, broadcasting, and media production, etc. So they discard all the others. They only keep those which are kind of tentatively related to news. Okay, so those are the domains or the interest IDs that are retained back. The rest are discarded. After this process, they gathered 20K plus Facebook page interest ID pairs. So you see, from 2466 seed pairs of Facebook page interest ID, they have now got 20K Facebook page interest IDs. Okay, so this is an interesting approach. Some of you who are doing your term assignments might also think of similar approaches of extending your data set volume. Okay, so this is a distribution of the different genres of pages that they collected, or interest IDs that they collected. So magazine, newspaper, journalist, news company, website, radio station. So the largest proportion seems to be coming from TV shows. There are around 4,447 interest IDs that have been gathered from TV show, and some of the example outlets are listed there. Okay, so another intriguing observation that the authors make is that the journalist pages, the individual journalist pages, though they are not many in number, only 750, but some of them drag huge audience. We will see in a moment how this audience base is collected, but for the time being, believe me that the authors were able to drag the audience base. And what they saw is some of these journalists like Bill O'Reilly, Lester Holt, Megyn Kelly. So all of them actually drag a huge audience base, starting from somewhere around 2 million to 1.3 million. So this is kind of interesting. So although they have there are very less pages from them, but they drag a lot of audience. So any questions so far? Otherwise we'll proceed. Everything fine? Should we proceed? Okay, so I proceed assuming that there is no questions. Okay, so now, so you see the first problem the authors have resolved: how to get Facebook pages at scale. So they have now 20,000 plus Facebook page interest ID pairs. The second question was how to gather the audience data. So for this, they use the same method that I taught you during the discrimination through optimization lectures. Okay, they use ad targeting. So you remember I showed you the Facebook audience API for an ad. So it's exactly same that we have seen earlier. So here you can mention the location of the audience, you can mention the age group, you can mention the gender, and you can mention the interest of the audience. This is very important. So here is where the authors needed the interest ID. Okay. So once you put the interest ID, then you get the number of audience. So immediately it shows the potential reach is around 2600000000 people. Okay. So the moment you put this constraint that the interest should be New York Times, you get to see what is the audience that this ad target is going to be able to reach. So basically this is exactly what people follow while doing Facebook ad targeting. So they specify the target population and say that this should have a specific attribute or a set of attributes, okay? And then you gather the size of the targeted audience. So a small simulation is what follows. Suppose you have mentioned that the audience should be United States. You have also mentioned that the target audience should be between 18 to 65 years of age. The target audience should be both from men and women. So it's all inclusive of all genders. The target audience should be interested in New York Times. In addition, okay, so this you can do for other interest IDs also, like say Breitbart, Washington Post, etc., etc. Any other Facebook page for which you have actually the interest ID available with you. And then you can have the audience size. So it immediately tells you what is your potential reach. Okay. You can, in addition, ask for demographic details. So filtration through demographic details. So you see, if you ask US politics very liberal, under New York Times, what is the primary interest ID, if you further use a demographic attribute like US politics very, very liberal, you immediately get the reach. And in this case, the authors found that the reach is around 5.2 million. Among the total reach of the target audience, okay, of New York Times, if you have a filter like US politics very liberal, then the reach would become 5.2 million. Okay. Similarly, the authors collected the audience number for different demographic attributes. For US politics moderate, you get 3.6 million. For US politics liberal, you get 4.8 million. For conservatives, you get 2.3 million. For very conservative, you get 1.5 million. So for the publishing agency, New York Times, corresponding to their Facebook page, New York Times, corresponding to their interest ID, New York Times, and a specific demographic filter, US politics liberal, you get 5.2 million audience as your ad targets. So this is how they find the user demographic, the demographics of the audience. Is this clear to you? This is a very intriguing method of course, for this, you yourself need to be an advertiser. Okay, you need to buy advertising facilities on Facebook, as I told you all earlier also in the discrimination through optimization paper. And once you do this, you get this demographic statistics. Is this clear to you? Should we proceed? Okay, fine. So now you see they have got data for the Facebook page and the interest ID, as well as the demographic information about the audience of each of these Facebook pages. So the authors collected 6 demographic features, which includes gender, racial affinity, age, national identity, income level, and political leaning. Okay, so the political leaning could be very conservative, conservative, moderate, liberal, very liberal. Income level also has different buckets. National identity could be Australia, Africa, Canada, East Asia, etc., etc. Racial affinity could be African Americans, Asian Americans, Caucasians, Hispanic. Age, they have categorized into various buckets like 13 to 17, 18 to 24, etc., etc. So they collected the audience statistic, the population associated with each media outlet under these 6 demographic features. Now, after this, they do some interesting statistics. So this is the pie chart describing the political leaning distribution of the New York Times. So what do we see? We see that a large majority of audience for New York Times is very liberal or liberal. Okay, so you immediately understand the political bias that is probably there in the news media outlet, the New York Times, okay, by observing the bias in the target audience. Okay, so this was what was their original hypothesis. Okay, so more interesting results. So now, after they see this distribution, the authors try to quantify the bias in a more concrete way. So they try to express bias as a function of the audience demographics. How do they do so? For example, to measure the political bias, they multiply the percentage of audience in each category by the following weights. Say, if it is very liberal, then the weight that they associate with it is -2. If it is liberal, then the weight associated is -1. If it is moderate, the weight associated is 0. If it is conservative, the weight associated is 1. And if it is very conservative, the weight associated is 2. Okay. So in this way, they put a weight on each of the different political leanings. Okay. So you have the target or percentage target audience, and you have the political leanings. They just multiply these two things. Very simple measure. And the higher the score, the media outlet has a stronger conservative bias. Okay, bias towards conservative issues. So if you to look at the initial New York Times distribution, and if you compute the bias score, you see that it is -0.569, which is kind of indicative of that it is left-leaning or more liberal. So one can also have demographic dimensions of other demographic dimensions of news audience, right? So it could be, say, gender, age group, racial affinity, political leaning, as we have already seen political leaning, income level, education level, language spoken, relationship status, lots and lots of other demographic issues. So if you remember, the authors collected the audience, target audience base for at least 6 of the demographic features. And now we will see some more interesting results that they observe. So if you look at the overall composition of Facebook, this is how the demographic distribution looks like. So the male female is like 46 to 54%, African American is 16%, Asian American is 3.4%, 5%, Caucasian is 64.3, etc., etc. Different age groups also have different distributions, like the larger chunk is younger, is the younger age group. This is the overall population of Facebook in the US. Okay, income level is also like 50K to 75K, and 75K to 155K is the largest chunk. So this is what is the overall demographic distribution of the Facebook users in the US. Now let us see what happens if we consider a specific news article or news media outlet. So Breitbart is a known news media outlet which is conservative. So the political leaning is shown on the top right hand side corner. Okay, so this is the political leaning of Breitbart, and as you see, it's highly conservative. Okay, now if you look at the other demographic features of the audience of Breitbart, you find certain interesting things. So let us look at the age distribution. So the age distribution of the target audience for Breitbart is as follows. So audiences of the age 18 to 24 is 2.5% only, compared to the overall population of Facebook in US, which is 16.3. You see, there's a huge discrepancy. Similarly, 25 to 34. So on Breitbart, such audience number is 7.9%, whereas in the overall Facebook population in the US, it's 25.3%. On the other hand, in Breitbart, the number of audience above 65 years of age is 31.7%, which is just 9.9% if you see the overall Facebook population in the US. Okay. Similarly, if you look at the natives and expats in the Breitbart audience distribution, 96.3% are natives, whereas in the overall Facebook population, it is 84.3. Also, in terms of ethnicity, if you look at the Breitbart results, Hispanic is just 6.2%, whereas in the overall population, it is 16.1%, overall Facebook population of US. Similarly, Similarly, Africans, it's 5.9% only in Breitbart, whereas it is 16.1% in the overall Facebook population. Okay, the majority of ethnicity is Caucasian on the Breitbart, as far as the Breitbart audience goes, which is again pretty interesting, and seems that this has some correlation with the political leaning. So this was what the authors observed, and they saw that looking at the target audience, you can actually identify whether the target audience political leaning could actually indicate the political leaning of a particular news outlet. Okay. Now, one might question that how do you validate this approach? Okay. So the question here comes is that, okay, we have seen some target audience, etc. But are there some additional ways in which one can validate all the observations? For instance, if you also observe, so this target audience is kind of a proxy, right? So the leaning of the target audience might not necessarily be the leaning of the news outlet itself. The authors hypothesize that these two leanings might have a strong correlation, but can we have a even stronger validation? Okay, that was what was the question that the authors posed forward. So in order to see if such a validation could be done, what the authors did was the following. So they looked into the literature, and it seems like in the literature, there has been quite a few works where people have done such media bias analysis on a small set of newspapers. So this is where the authors actually make a very big contribution, and this is where the paper departs from the previous methods. So while the authors have been working on around 20K plus articles, the previous analysis focused on somewhere between 36 to 500 articles. Okay. So, however, these articles, the authors say, could be kind of a ground truth for them, and using them, they check the authenticity of the results that they observe based on their audience demography based results. Okay. So they take 4 such methods. One was by Mitchell et al. In 2014. This was by the Pew Research Center. They studied 36 media outlets. And then there was one by Bakshi et al. In 2015. This work was published in Science. And they considered 500 media outlets. There was one by Budak et al., which was published in Public Opinion Quarterly in 2016. They had 15 media outlets. And then there is this allsides.com, which actually takes, so this is a media watchdog. So this takes 112 news media outlets and tries to ask its authors about the political leaning of each of the news articles. Okay, so they take these 4 different set of ground truth studies, and then they try to see if their audience demography based result match with the results already reported in these analyses. So first thing that the authors needed to do was to collect the number of the total number of Facebook page interest ID pairs that are available for each of these news domains that are studied in each of these literature. Okay. So Pew Research reported 36. There is a typo here. So total is 36 and they identified 32. So Pew Research actually identified, they had reported 36 media outlets, out of which the authors could only map 32 and have a Facebook page interest ID mapping for these 32 only. The other 4 they could not. For Bakshi et al., out of 500, they could only have 342 cases where they had a Facebook page interest ID mapping. For Budak et al., they were able to get 100% mappings. For allsides.com, they could map only 81 out of 112. Okay. Now, each of these methods actually had different ways of annotating something to be politically linked. And this had to be aligned with whatever the authors call as politically linked. So for Pew Research, what they did was they did a 10-question survey. And in this, they asked whether, in this survey, they asked whether you see if an article is consistently liberal, mostly conservative, consistently conservative, etc. So this is what the Pew Research guys asked. And what the authors did here, the authors of the current paper, they imagined that consistently liberal could be mapped to their -2 weight, mostly liberal could be mapped to their -1 weight, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is how they mapped the annotations done by the Pew Research authors into their weight levels. So the Bakshi et al., what they did was they took this 500 news media outlets and then they asked around 10 million Facebook users about the political leanings. Okay, and the Facebook users had to respond about the political leaning of each of the 500 outlets. The Budak et al., okay, so there they used 2 scales. One scale of -1, -0.5, 0, 0.5 and 1 for the Democrats, and similarly 1, 0.50, minus 0.5 and minus 1 for the Republicans. And they asked Amazon Mechanical Turkers to annotate a bunch of political stories as to whether they are Democrat leaned or Republic leaned. Okay, and now, so for each story they get a rating for each from each of the Turkers, and they then average over all the Turkers and over all the news stories to get a particular bias score. And then all sides again is survey based. They ask their users as to whether the news article that the users are reading, whether it is left, center, lean right, and right. Okay, so now again the authors align these maps, these annotations to their weights, as left would be -2, lean left would be -1, center should be 0, and so on and so forth. So in this way, they actually mapped the ground truth studies in a way so that they can compare their results with the ground truth studies. For all these news outlets that they identify, they are using their audience demographics. So the bias score that they measured earlier. So using the audience demography statistics, as I showed you earlier, New York Times had a score of -0.59 or 529, whatever. So those scores are being compared with the scores of this ground truth data. Okay, and for each of these ground truth data, they show how they actually construct the score. So now, if you study the correlations, what they observe is that for all the ground truth data, say Pew Research, Bakshi et al., Budak et al., the correlation is pretty high. So for instance, Pew Research and Bakshi et al., the correlation is above 0.9. Budak is also, correlation is like close to 0.9. The only difference arises in all sides. The reason behind this difference is that for all sides, as I have showed you, there is this center which the authors actually map to 0. However, many of these which are called center in all sides, authors find them to be liberals. So and they saw that in the other 3 ground truths, many of these are actually marked liberals and not center. Okay, so or lean left basically. So they are marked lean left in all the other data sets except for this all sides, and therefore there is this mismatch, and therefore there is a lower correlation. Is this clear? Is the correlation plot clear to all of you? Can we proceed? Okay, fine. So this was an interesting set of validation statistics that the authors reported. And then they also actually studied the confidence interval. So they had a very high confidence actually for the Pew Research and Bakshi. It's between 0.946 and 0.987 for Pew Research, and 0.891 and 0.927 for Bakshi. For Budak, it is a little less, but for all sides, it's less, and we understand now why it is a little less. So they also find some very interesting characterizations. So this is like how the media is demographically biased across different demographics. For instance, so this is very similar to some of the things that I was telling you in our discrimination through optimization class. So you see that many of the male target audience are being targeted with news articles like Guys Guns, Soft Rap, etc. Conservative and male, things like Drudge Report, Rush Limbaugh Show. So you understand, like, see what are the kind of things. So if you mix and match conservative and male, what is the kind of news articles that these people are exposed to, you find this kind of news articles. Conservative and female, Pray America, lifenews.com and things like that. Okay, liberal and female, see the first one, The Man Repeller. Then feministing.com, everyday feminism. Okay, so you clearly see strong signals of bias if you look into this kind of mix and matches. Okay, so you can, so this, the authors actually have given a very nice framework, not only to study bias in one demographic scale, but also to mix and match demographic scales and see what are the effects of the biases. And interestingly, the authors have actually made a portal available where you can go and search for a particular media article and see the political as well as the other types of demographic alignments of that article. So I'll share the link to the portal through the email, through our common group email. You can yourself try and use it. But I think this particular story gives us a very nice idea of how bias is being, exerted through the news media outlets in social media. So we'll stop here, and if you have any questions, please go ahead now. Otherwise, if you have any questions later, you can send me or the TAs through the group account. Any questions? Any further questions? No questions? Okay, so we stop here and we meet again Wednesday at class time. I will raise a meeting ID.